Hello and welcome to this short video showcasing a pack of cards, 10 cards, featuring pictures of Grand Prix drivers from the 1950s. Some of them raced into the 60s, but predominantly 50s drivers. This pack I've had for a number of years. I think I got this pack in 1989, along with numerous other packs covering cars and drivers from the decades of Formula One up to the end of 1980, when the cards were produced. Let us begin. This gentleman is Giuseppe Farina, winner of only 5 Grand Prix, but he won the first ever World Championship Grand Prix at Silverstone in 1950, and he won the first ever World Championship in 1950. Grand Prix racing had been going since 1906, but the World Championship didn't start until 1950. And this guy, who was getting on, I think he was 44 years old when he won the World Championship. He died in 1966 on his way to the French Grand Prix as both a spectator and because after the Grand Prix there was going to be filming for the 1966 film Grand Prix starring James Garner, and he was going to be a driving double for one of the actors, Yves Montand, I think. But he was driving too fast through the Alps on his way, hit a telegraph pole and died on the spot instantly. That's a fact I only learnt just recently. A spectacular way to go, very unfortunate. 60 years old he was. But anyway, the very first world champion in an Alfa Romeo. Here we have one of the most famous Grand Prix drivers of them all. Juan Manuel Fangio, winner of 5 world championships, 24 Grand Prix. He won in Alfa Romeos. I think he won in an Alfa Romeo, Mercedes, possibly a Maserati as well, I think, and Ferrari. One of his championships in 1956. He got very lucky in the last race, but I'll tell you about that later in the film, when I get to the other driver involved. But yes, considered to be one of the greatest of all time, 5 world championships. He held the record for the most number of championships for 46 years until Michael Schumacher beat it. Michael Schumacher went on to win 7 world championships, of course. He died relatively recently, actually, 1995. Okay, now this guy, Alberto Ascari, he, to this day, is the only Italian driver to have won the World Championship in a Ferrari. must be the dream of every Ferrari fan to have an Italian driver winning the championship. Although they are very much so more obsessed with the team than they are with the drivers. Italian Formula One fans will, by and large, certainly the majority, will want a foreigner to win in a Ferrari rather than an Italian in any other team. But surely an Italian in a Ferrari would be the ultimate. Alberto Ascari did it in 1952 and 1953. In the 1955 Monaco Grand Prix, Alberto Ascari, who won 13 races in his career, in the 1955 Monaco Grand Prix, he actually crashed into the harbour, amazingly. It's incredible. You can actually see the clip of him doing that. I think it's, I've seen it on TV. It's probably on YouTube. Crashed into the harbour. They managed to fish him out and the car. And amazingly, he was alive. That's great and everything. And then 2 weeks later, he had an accident in testing at Monza in Italy and was killed. So that's quite tragic, really. But 2 weeks after being fished out of the harbour in Monaco. I said he won 13 races, he did, and 9 of them were on the trot, which is still, I think, the joint most wins on the trot by any Grand Prix driver. Sebastian Vettel equalled it in 2013 when he won the last 9 races on the trot. Ascari's 9 wins were across 2 seasons. But yes, very impressive. He is also, amazingly, one of only 4 drivers to have ever held the top spot for most number of championships. He was the first multiple championship winner, having won in 52 and 53. So he held the record then. Fangio then came along and won 5 world championships, so he held the record. And that held for 46 years until Schumacher took it. And then last year, Lewis Hamilton equalled Schumacher and may well go clear at the top this year if he wins, or he will do if he wins an 8th world championship. But yeah, amazingly, only 4 drivers: Alberto Ascari, Juan Manuel Fangio, Michael Schumacher and Lewis Hamilton, the only drivers to have held that top spot. Mike Hawthorn, this is the first British world champion. Great Britain has had more world champions than any other country. More world champions, more world championships won as well, and more Grand Prix won than any other country, more points scored than any other country, and more pole positions scored than any other country. British drivers have dominated, particularly in the 60s, and at the moment with Lewis Hamilton. But they're at the top. Great Britain is at the top of every stat that there is. And this guy was the first world champion. I think there have been 10 British world champions. This guy was top. Sorry, this guy was the first, Mike Hawthorn. He nearly didn't win the championship because Stirling Moss, who was runner-up 4 years, I think 4 years running in the 50s, there was a race where Stirling Moss won and Mike Hawthorn was second. But Mike Hawthorn was then disqualified on a technicality. And Stirling Moss, amazingly, campaigned on Mike Hawthorn's behalf to get his points reinstated, even though he was a championship challenger to Moss. And the appeal was upheld, and Mike Hawthorn got his points back, 6 points for second place. And I think beat Moss in the championship by definitely less than that, 1 or 2 points. So good bit of sportsmanship by Stirling Moss, lost him the championship to Mike Hawthorn. Mike Hawthorn died not many months after winning the World Championship, whilst driving on a normal road in England. He was driving too fast. Formula One World Champion, driving fast, shouldn't have been, went off the road, hit a tree, was killed. That was the end of that. This guy, Jack Brabham, the first Australian world champion, winner of 3 championships, 1959, 1960 and 1966. He is particularly well known for being the only driver that has managed to win a world championship in his own car, his own team, basically. Yeah, in 1959 and 1960, he won the championships in a Cooper. In 1966, he won the world championship in his own team, Brabham, of course, which is went on to become a famous Grand Prix team. So that's quite an achievement. The following year, he nearly won it again, but instead his teammate Denny Hulme won it. He died quite recently, 2014, I think he died. Now this guy, Jose Froilan Gonzalez. This guy, he doesn't look like a Grand Prix driver, does he? But back then you just had to be strong. You didn't have to be fit as such, you just had to be strong. And he still had to be talented, of course, but as regards physique, it was all about strength more so than fitness. And even though he doesn't look the fittest guy, he died again quite recently, 2013, at the age of 90. So quite impressive. He only won 2 races, but he is particularly well known for being Ferrari's first ever Grand Prix winner. The 1951 British Grand Prix, which might have been at Silverstone, might have been at Aintree in Liverpool. I'm not sure which one. But yeah, the 1951 British Grand Prix. This guy Gonzalez won in a Ferrari. The guy who founded Enzo Ferrari, Enzo Ferrari, he was originally a mechanic for Alfa Romeo in the 40s, late 40s, and he decided to go off and form his own team. I bet his other teammates were probably thinking that wasn't going to come to anything, as Enzo Ferrari left Alfa Romeo to set up his own team. But it worked. And Ferrari are quite unique amongst all car manufacturers. Other car manufacturers go racing in order to advertise their road cars. However, Ferrari have always been first and foremost a racing team. They build road cars in order to fund their motor racing. It's the other way around. They only have road cars because they want to fund their motor racing, which I think is great. Froilan Gonzalez. Stirling Moss. As I said earlier, 4 times a runner-up. One of them never won the championship. Probably the greatest driver never to have won the championship. And he, as I say, in 1958, he lost out through sportsmanship, sticking up for his title rival, Mike Hawthorn. He died very recently, 2020. Last year he died at the age of 91. Always on TV, which is great. Interviews, hanging around Grand Prix. Only up until just a few years ago, he was still racing, not competitive racing, but showing cars off, old cars at festivals. Amazing longevity, Stirling Moss. But yeah, a real true icon of the sport. This guy, I don't really know this guy that much. Well, I know the name, I've always known the name, Jean Behra, Frenchman. But I can't really tell you much about him. He never won a Grand Prix. Not sure why he's in this pack, really. He looks like a friendly chap, though, doesn't he? He died in 1959, probably in a car of some description. Not necessarily a Grand Prix car, because as we know, Mike Hawthorn died in his own car. So this guy, probably in a race car, though. And this guy looking a little bit more mean and moody than Jean Bearer. This is Maurice Trintignon, who is, I believe, the uncle of a well-known French director. So well-known that I'm struggling with his name. I think it's Jean-Claude Trintignon. Anyway, this guy's his uncle. He also died, again, quite recent. Grand Prix drivers tend to either die in the 50s or 60s, these old Grand Prix drivers, 50s or 60s, or only a few years ago. So it was one or the other, nothing in between. For instance, none of these drivers died in the 70s or 80s, which is odd. Anyway, although I suppose maybe it isn't. You either die in a car accident on the racetrack or you die of old age. But this guy probably shouldn't be smoking, seeing as he's sitting in basically a petrol can on wheels. So he probably shouldn't be smoking. But there you go, he won 2 races. Maurice Trintignon. Now these guys, got 2 for the price of 1 here. This fella, Tony Brooks, he, out of this deck, is the only one that is still alive. A lot of these were still alive when the cards were made in 1989, but now, in 2021, this guy, Tony Brooks, is the only one still alive. I think he's 89. I saw him on TV just the other day. Winner of 5 Grand Prix. But yeah, his main claim to fame, what he's mostly famous for, is basically still being alive. He was a good driver, though, Sterling Moss's teammate at one point. And yeah, he was well thought of, as was this guy, Peter Collins, who, going back to Fangio, I said that one Manuel Fangio was lucky in the last race in 1956 to win the championship. That's because this guy gave him his car, his teammate. There was an agreement beforehand that one of the 4 Ferrari drivers, back then you had as many cars in the race as you could afford, basically. So Ferrari might have 4 or 5, another poorer team might only have 1. I quite like that, because then if you get a dominant team, you've got lots of drivers all with the same equipment. But anyway, one of the drivers, not Collins, but one of them was going to hand his car over to Fangio. That's the sort of thing that happened in the 50s. If someone retired, a lesser driver would be required to come into the pits and just hand his car over. Basically, the other guy had already retired. The one that the arrangement was with had already retired before Fangio retired his car. So they called in Luigi Musso. But Luigi Musso was an Italian in a Ferrari at the Italian Grand Prix, and he ignored all the requests to come in. Ignored every single one. Even coming in for a pit stop and refusing to get out of the car during his pit stop. So they were not going to call this guy in because they knew he was a championship challenger, so they didn't want to call this guy in. So basically Fangio had retired and lost the championship. Moss was leading the race. This guy, Peter Collins, was, Tony Brooks, Peter Collins. That's right. I don't know if I called him Peter Brooks. If I did, Tony Brooks, Peter Collins. This guy came in for a pit stop. He was in 2nd place. As it stood, Moss was going to be world champion at long last. And this guy was going to finish second unless he could get past Moss, and there was a good chance he could have done because he wasn't far behind him. He came in for a pit stop. He saw Fangio sitting in a chair in the pits. The team didn't ask Collins to give up his seat, but he did anyway because he saw Fangio as the main guy in the team. So Collins jumped out of his car, out of his Ferrari, handed it to Fangio. Fangio went off, finished second in the race, and won the World Championship by 1 or 2 points or something over Sterling Moss, who won the race. I mean, that's the sort of sportsmanship. It's crazy sportsmanship, really, but over-the-top sportsmanship. He wasn't even asked to hand in his car, but that's the sort of thing that you would get in the 50s. Great sportsmanship between the drivers. Okay, so, and the other thing to say about Peter Collins, everyone said, don't worry, he will go on to win a championship. But unfortunately, just 2 years later at the German Grand Prix, he had an accident and was killed. He had 3 Grand Prix wins in his career. It's not many, but drivers back then often didn't. There was only 6 or 7 races a year, lots of retirements. So if you managed to win 5 races, that was a bit of an achievement. That's why Fangio's 24 is seen as such a high amount. But Lewis Hamilton is top at the moment with 98 wins. But there's a lot more races per season now and a lot less retirements. So, there you go. I shall do my other packs at some point. Probably the 1950s cars would be the next one I'll do. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to subscribe, please do so. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much.